final guest is Jami Taylor, who is in the pharmaceutical business, Vice President of Protagonist Pharmaceuticals, formerly at Janssen, a subsidiary of J&J, and also in brackets, a long-term supporter and colleague in the Health Impact Fund business. Jami Taylor works in the pharmaceutical industry and in particular has been involved in some drug development, including bedaquiline, also known as Ceturo, an important drug against TB, and we'll hopefully talk a little bit about that and in general about the problem of getting drugs developed for diseases that are predominantly affecting poor people.
And Thomas, just let me know, how much time do we have? I want to make sure that I keep this as tight as you need.
Until 5:20. So that would be, in your time, that would be 2:20, I think.
Perfect. Okay, great. So hopefully we'll have time for a great discussion. I'll pull together some of the key themes that you've heard already today. Dan, of course, has shown us how participation, creativity, and advocacy can take shape on the ground and have impact in resolving health equities at the community level. A lot of the themes that Gary brought forward from his perch at Partners in Health are those that you'll see me weave into my presentation. He outlined, of course, remarkable inequities in healthcare as he observed them and his Partners in Health has worked against them. He talked about the challenge of fragmentation across healthcare ecosystems and the actors within it. Dan, of course, encouragingly told us about ways that he, even from a community-based organization, has woven together different actors through partnerships, I think really admirably so. Gary talked about the challenge of achieving, quote, long and preservable state of results, and where there are healthcare gains, ensuring that there are long-term improvements in outcomes. And he implied a certain fragility that I'll speak to as well, that really merits what will be an overarching theme of my presentation, and that's opportunities for your participation, creativity, and advocacy with respect to healthcare access as a fundamental social justice issue, and the fact that wherever your path may take you from now going forward, you can be an advocate even within the industry as I have. And I'll speak to some of those limitations, constraints, and ways that I personally have worked to navigate around them, but more importantly, how you can look for ways to resolve fragmentation, inequity, and seek out and hopefully preserve long-term gains for the good of many millions of people in the way that those who've spoken to us already had. So I wanted to illustrate certain dynamics at play and speak to what I think will be a really core set of objectives. First, examining current and longstanding tensions around R&D investment decisions within the context of research-based pharmaceutical companies, how these tensions play out and what the implications are for categories of diseases. And here you see where it's probably most starkly illustrated, where there's unmet need but limited commercial opportunity. And of course, the category that I'll zero in on is neglected tropical diseases, neglected being, of course, a certainly apropos moniker. So the question that we'll really pursue today as part of my portion of the discussion is, why does private capital tend to flow so heavily into some areas of biomedical R&D, such as oncology, and so little into others, such as neglected diseases? I think some of the answers to this question are intuitive, but some take some unpacking and unraveling, and we'll have an opportunity to delve into that. And again, hopefully look at some solutions that you can participate in as advocates, and hopefully spur some discussion that can lead into new solutions and new models or stacks of models that can support sustainable progress. So here are some proposed objectives to help frame our discussion. First, I'm hoping to bring the role of access to medicines into context. Gary's, of course, done a brilliant job of that already, as he's laid out the fundamental role of access to medicines in healthcare systems overall, and that foundational piece of strong healthcare systems and this sort of feedback loop within these two components. I want to make sure that I outline for you the innovator pharma business model as it stands, with attention to its current limitations, hoping that you'll be able to apply some really brilliant imagination to reconsidering this business model as it stands. And on that note, highlighting opportunities for advocacy and support of access to quality healthcare worldwide, and really thinking creatively about even how deeply embedded systems can be restructured and reimagined so that we can pursue, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to live within a very different system instead of business models, incentives, and interests. So Gary brought forward a key theme that really is very much attributable to Partners in Health and Paul Farmer, and has been a key, I think, a key sort of lighthouse for many of us who work within access to medicines, and that's the need for staff, space, and systems. And in the spirit of reimagining, where I sit right now, I work with a team of innovators who are truly visionaries on the access to medicines front, who are considering how traditional notions of staff, space, and systems can be reconfigured in the context of how we develop drugs. So the idea is that where there are high infrastructure modes of delivery of medications and very expensive high infrastructure medications in the form of, for example, monoclonal antibodies or large molecule drugs that require a patient to travel to a facility, sit within a sophisticated, clean facility, and receive medical care under monitoring by a nurse or a physician or a whole medical team via injection or IV, that they're through the power of reimagining and new technologies, that these sorts of medicines can be reconfigured to be orally delivered or packaged within at-home available injections that can be delivered really at that last mile. And so when we think about advocacy and imagination, I hope that you'll consider even these notions well beyond traditional ideas of advocacy. This can happen even at the idea of how we conceive of technology and how we can overcome current limitations in staff, space, and systems to reformulate ways of delivering medicine and ways of making sure that healthcare systems aren't burdened by new modalities of delivering medicines that patients need. Now, looking to NTDs as this illustrative set of examples, the unmet need there is severe and persistent. Of course, we see that 1.7 billion people are affected by neglected tropical diseases, and yet the amount of private capital that I mentioned earlier that goes into medicines and the level of energy that the private industry places in development of new treatments for neglected tropical diseases is really abysmal, and has been historically, as these notes show from DNDi, or that's Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, a great resource for all of you. We know that whether it's snake bites, tuberculosis, soil-transmitted helminthiasis, in the whole panoply of neglected tropical diseases, there are major drivers of human suffering and perhaps more importantly, cycles of poverty that keep whole communities and even whole countries and regions in states of poverty. And despite recognition of the need for R&D in the direction of global public health needs, forward movement remains limited. I definitely recommend that anyone look at this Nature article from February of last year, really calling upon a shift, recognizing the massive imbalances, as you see here illustrated, of more than 56,000 candidate products currently under development. More than half are for cancerous tumors, certainly a noble endeavor, but only 0.5% are for neglected tropical diseases. And again, this imbalance suggests that there are ways of retooling incentive models, and that will be, again, our focus for today. Many of you hopefully have had an opportunity to flip through the Access to Medicines Index that Thomas provided you. It's interesting, this has been something that's been coming out now for the better part of a decade, ranking pharmaceutical companies and their participation in neglected disease R&D, in access to medicines more broadly. And there is a certain despondence that characterized the 2022 report, which is the most recent report. You see these key findings here, which we'll return to. And this one, of course, some companies engaging in R&D for emerging infectious diseases are there, NTDs within that category, but the pipeline is mainly empty. So what's a proposed starting point for our problem solving? I think that we can we can best position ourselves for that creativity and advocacy that I mentioned, where we can really understand the business model as it's situated within larger policy models and so forth. And the challenges of fragmentation that Gary brought up are certainly part of this. So I hope you'll include that as a lens as I walk you through what many people consider to be a black box, which I think frustrates many advocates. This lack of understanding about what really goes on behind that curtain of investment committees and these early R&D investment decisions that ultimately translate over periods of decades, even into the state of health in whole communities and regions around the world. And I think the benefits of this exercise are already suggested are that we can more capably evaluate and shape proposals to shift industry behavior to meet certain goals as we understand what's within this black box. And of course, I'll just give you a glimpse today, but I hope that all of you will consider this a worthy path of research going forward as you think expansively about new models and so forth, as your illustrious professor Ada Thomas Pogge has for many years. I think you'll see that there are real glimmers of hope on the horizon, and hopefully you'll give shape to those. So, speaking in some ways, sympathetically on the part of someone who sits within the pharmaceutical industry and has, at this point for decades, I think it's fair to suggest that the industry is really contending constantly with a lot of challenges, including high costs and risk, long development timelines, heavy regulation, and I think it's important to recognize the influence of the capital markets, investor influence and pressure on companies large and small within the sector. As an illustration of that, my company, with a real access orientation, pursued investment in a set of emerging markets focused clinical trials. We called them the Malaysia Project because Malaysia was very much the centerpiece of our work. And again, we were trying to find treatment naive populations, naive only through lack of access to healthcare, and to see if we could really drive first line care in that sort of last mile way with one of our innovative products. The level of investor skepticism that we fielded was tremendous. The level of investor feedback that we needed to maintain a focus solely within high income markets was almost overwhelming. And that pressure ultimately takes its form and its share price value, unfortunately, for publicly traded companies such as this one. And so, I mean, that piece of the puzzle may be one that many of you are participating in, even those who sit one day in positions of allocating capital across this sector or others, and it's important to recognize it as a key feature. Note that I've grayed out here realities of R&D because I want us to think, again, expansively and not be so calcified within current systems. And long development timelines is something that the industry really sat on as a point of consternation that it expressed in NTD discussions and otherwise. We've seen those hurdles traversed, arguably, within the COVID-19 vaccine context and so forth. And there's a sense that, especially in an age of machine learning and AI acceleration and so forth, that long development timelines may not be the hurdle that they've presented in the past, and therein lie some really important opportunities for us. And of course, we have to recognize that the business model that the industry adheres to is shaped very heavily by policy frameworks, inclusive of what's illustrated here on this slide, and then, of course, market exclusivity protections, which create their own drivers and barriers to access, of course. So the broad contours of decision-making in drug development, as they're considered behind these sort of closed doors within the industry, really come down to a central criteria of the state of the science and commercial viability, so to speak. And those become their own limiting factors when it comes to NTDs and diseases of poverty. Many other considerations obviously come into play, but those essential pillars, the state of the science, I mean, is there a ripe enough, proven enough mechanism of action against a given target to support forward movement and the substantial investment required to advance something all the way through several phases of clinical study, the regulatory process and market entry, and within that market entry and as its own sort of guiding light, that this commercial viability piece comes into question, which brings forward notions of, as noted on the right hand of the slide, ability to pay, et cetera, which creates, again, a further set of barriers. I mentioned capital markets, of course. The industry is always taking cues from its shareholder base, from the external environment. And the issue of opportunity cost is constantly looming over all R&D decision making. It's a wrestle often of good versus good. In the case study that I'll show you around tuberculosis and a decision that we made within Johnson & Johnson to pursue a development of a tuberculosis asset, even MDR-TB, something that Gary spoke a great deal about. In that case, we knew that we were directly taking from the neuroscience department's budget as it related to a late stage Alzheimer's disease asset. So there are many ethical wrestles that happen in the context of internal pharma company investment committee decisions. It's good versus good and often feels lose-lose as we allocate resources and given directions. Of course, degree of difficulty also matters. This is from another Nature paper, this image, and illustrates in part why it's so difficult to get to these, to get above these thresholds of state of the science and commercial viability when it comes to neglected diseases. And the result is market failure. I love the fact that Gary brought forward, I think so powerfully, the Greenlight Committee and the way that it was creating a market to overcome that, and overcoming market failure is hopefully something that you'll consider wrestling with long term as you apply your own brilliant imaginations and advocacy to this work. It's important to understand too that downstream commercial considerations come into view. As I've sat as an advocate for global public health R&D within investment committee, a term has come up that always makes me wince, and it's absorptive capacities. A given market's absorptive capacity for a new product. And this affects even the industry's willingness to take a product that may have made it all the way through the R&D process that's novel and on the market in high-income countries, but where there's this hesitancy around bringing it to low-income markets. And that sometimes relates to what sometimes is euphemistically referred to as absorptive capacity. I would suggest that the notion of absorptive capacity offers opportunities for greater imagination, advocacy, to some extent health system strengthening, as we learned, I think, so powerfully from Gary and so powerfully from Dan as well, as he described health system strengthening in the form of actually taking part in it on the ground. I would also suggest that thinking about absorptive capacity in terms of new technological gains that we can make, turning injectables to orals, for example, as we think about the ways that we might formulate medicines. There's lots of room to think outside the boxes that we've created in the access to medicines debate as it stands. And again, really thinking expansively in this arena can open up many opportunities for change. So this is I've put here in this box something that's been a frustration that I've heard, and this is almost a verbatim quote from a colleague years ago who was actually in charge of global pricing at Johnson & Johnson. And he said, I wish that people who are advocates for access to medicines would understand that ours is a business model not of our own making. And this is a business model that's heavily shaped by external forces that are both the source and bane of our existence. Essentially, we're locked into this system, IP systems, pricing imperatives, capital markets. All of these external forces are really pushing us, compelling us in certain directions. I would suggest that the industry has fiercely protected its current model. I think that's a fair statement. There have been benefits to the current model, and we've seen this golden age of biopharmaceutical innovation geared in certain directions by incentives in policy, which I'll go through, that I think serve as points of inspiration for us who are advocates for global public health R&D, and that there's really room for reimagining the model of the future. It's important to also understand that R&D decision makers are constantly asking this question, and I think very crassly, and it really comes down to ROI, is the juice worth the squeeze? And as we really boil things down to sort of their crassest decision-making metric, that can also shine a light on ways that we can consider ways of changing the way that we squeeze, so to speak, whether it's through changing R&D models or changing ways that we approach this entire arena. I do think that opportunities and solutions lie in fundamental changes to the pharma R&D business model, but even tweaks to incentive structures, tweaks and advancements in technologies, and tweaks to the character of capital, impact investment, and so forth that facilitate this model can lead us to at least interim and incremental progress. Of course, we know going back to neglected diseases that industry is noticeably absent from major categories of neglected disease R&D. It's good to know the players that are participating in it. You know, from an aggregate R&D perspective, thinking about especially what private industry spends on R&D, these numbers that you see on the right-hand side of the chart from Policy Cures are relatively paltry, but they constitute a starting point, and again, helping us understand the landscape, as fragmented as it might be in some respects, as Gary has pointed out. And again, back to the current state, in light of how these rewards are structured in the current environment, private R&D funding for neglected diseases falls short relative to need. Interestingly enough, you've got HIV, TB, and malaria, but really HIV constituting the bulk of private R&D funding, and that's in part because there's what's called a dual market opportunity with HIV, where, as one of my colleagues once said, we can make our money in the West and then give away the rest. Not necessarily a sustainable model, but one that we can at least consider. And of course, you know, looking at the aggregate, $700 million here, you know, being at the top end of the range in 2018, it really suggests that there's a lot of room for improvement and hopefully whole new tidal waves of capital that we can direct in this direction. So a key question, and one that Gary has started to help us understand through the Greenlight Committee and so forth, is, are there ways that market failure can be overcome? Market failure being, I think, most starkly illustrated in the neglected tropical disease space. And are there examples in the industry of market failure conquered? And the short answer is yes, and I'll give you some historical context there. There was a time when cancer was something that was considered insurmountable, that had very paltry investment, public and private, directed at it. Many people count this massive array of work in oncology today in private industry, in the pharmaceutical industry. Many attribute what we see today and all of those gains to the 1971 National Cancer Act, which really was this watershed moment in the declaration of a war on cancer, and this multi-layered incentive strategy, inclusive of public sector funding of nonprofit advocacy groups, different pockets of public monies being directed at cancer, and of course, whole new stores of capital and support for private industry working on cancer. That was a watershed moment that's been built on over time, and that's a key theme as we think about whatever incentives we might have the opportunity to construct individually and as a group going forward. How can we make sure that there's a sustainability to the stacking of incentives so that they remain relevant? And in fact, if you look at State of the Union addresses in the US over the time since 1971, almost every single one has emphasized this war on cancer, the sustained work on the part of the US government, obviously, the core, you know, ability to pay, willingness to pay, highest and most important market for the pharmaceutical industry. Part of all of that dynamic was established in 1971, and we see it furthering today in the form of Biden's cancer moonshot, and again, many technological and other patient care gains and lives saved as part of this work. And continuing, as I mentioned, every year we see more progress made in this particular space. The Orphan Drug Act of 1983 is another major driver of R&D investment. This is such a powerful point of inspiration that I hope we'll consider in the context of NPDs and global public health R&D more generally. Arguably, there have been so many incentives stacked up in support, and here's sort of just a meager and light touch look at all of the incentives provided for rare disease innovators. Those have continued to stack up over time. Gary mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes specific exemptions to Medicare price negotiations with pharmaceutical manufacturers, specific exemptions for rare diseases, which constitute their own tier on this cake, which continues to grow and grow and grow. And of course, the gains against rare diseases have continued to grow, and companies, large and small, working on rare disease have increased in their market value significantly, illustrated in this case probably most starkly by the recent acquisition of Reata Pharmaceuticals with its innovation omaveloxolone for a patient population of 5,000 people in the US. It's a genetic disease of purely European descent, by the way, and that was an acquisition that Biogen made at a level of more than $7 billion for that single asset, a rare disease asset. And so you have this, what can arguably seen as a real imbalancing or a pendulum swing in these directions of oncology and rare disease, again with not a terrible dynamic, but suggesting to us, and hopefully all of us, that there can be incentives put in place that help to widen the pie and increase the capital allocated across a whole spectrum of diseases, particularly those that disproportionately affect the poor, as we've discussed. There hasn't been nothing in this space, but really isolated efforts to really drive neglected disease R&D, and prominent among these is the FDA priority review voucher, a system where if based on a set of FDA-approved neglected tropical diseases, where an innovator moves against those diseases and creates something that's viable for regulatory review, at the very least, there's an opportunity for that innovator to access what's called a priority review voucher, where they can shorten the FDA review process for any drug and within its own portfolio, or they can sell that sort of ticket, so to speak, to another innovator. And the market value of priority review vouchers has swung widely. Congress has loved this program so much that they've actually added, no surprise, some oncology-related opportunities and pediatric-related opportunities and rare disease-related opportunities, in terms of introduced legislation and so forth, to the priority review voucher program, which in some ways has diminished the total value, especially as it pertains to NTDs. But this is something that arguably has been successful, and it's allowed for non-traditional, non-industry actors to participate, such as the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, the TB Alliance, and others that aren't pharma companies per se, but are participants and can be remunerated participants in neglected tropical disease R&D, for example. And the PRV program really opened that door. But I would suggest that whereas it cracked the door open, there's room for more, where we can combine incentive models layered together, added upon over time. I call it carrot upon carrot. We can make a major difference in facilitating near and long-term investment in neglected disease R&D. There's momentum underway for new models that really consider this stacking. This is a brand new research paper put forward by the Center for Global Development just this month. I would encourage any of you to look at it. It's making headlines even just today, but it really proposes a grand bargain for something that's certainly a component of NTDs or relevant to it, and that's antimicrobial resistance, where there's an urgent and pressing need across high and low income markets to tackle this great public health threat. And so here within these bullet points, and I won't belabor them, there is this desire to stack and collect and resolve for fragmentation and layer in incentives upon incentives for actors to participate collectively in the R&D process and otherwise, to make sure there's access to new medicines against antimicrobial resistance. It's interesting because the grand bargain that CGD has put forward rests very heavily, as many of these models do, on the Health Impact Fund model, whose progenitor is here with us today in the form of your professor, who is really the giant upon which many are standing on the shoulders, where in the construction of these new incentive models. Now, Health Impact Fund model is something that many of you, I'm sure, have read about in the context of this course and heard from Professor Pogge about as he's designed it. It builds upon the current IP system, so there's no dismantling of the current state as I described it to you, that black box, that we've just disassembled and looked at it can continue to operate, which I think allows, it brings us a sense of pragmatism to this model, but it builds this next and additional path that allows companies to voluntarily participate under certain IP waiver and pricing agreements where they would make access and global health gains really the aim, and would be remunerated according to health impact as measured by the widely accepted health technology assessment standards. So the essence is contained on the Health Impact Fund website, healthimpactfund.org, and I would encourage you to all of you to go to that website to really look at this, in part because even as a standalone model, as much as it's been the inspiration for many other models that have been proposed, it's gaining significant traction. And this, as recently as August, this beautifully written op-ed piece in Le Monde, here you see the Health Impact Fund in the spotlight and gaining increasing support from advocates, and hopefully all of you listening on this line. So I strongly encourage you to think of the Health Impact Fund among the arsenal of incentives that you might consider supporting as part of this work, and in support of social justice in global health care access. And along those lines, I wanted to emphasize again that anywhere you sit within this ecosystem, even within the industry, you can be an advocate and you can work creatively in support of global healthcare access. And quickly, I'll move through a case study born at Johnson & Johnson, where I sat for many years, around the development and commercialization of bedaquiline, which was something that Gary highlighted for NDR-TB. Now, this was the discoverer of bedaquiline, a scientist who sat within Janssen, the pharmaceutical companies of Johnson & Johnson. Kuhn Andrews was someone who understood very acutely the business model of the pharma industry as it stood, and as he had a quiet and fervent passion around curing tuberculosis or finding some sort of discovery against tuberculosis, and worked very quietly and even secretively around it. In fact, he labeled this program a flu program for many years as he was developing the early work around it to make sure that it wasn't quickly killed in investment committee context, and to make sure that even behind closed doors, I think very heroically, he was able to ripen it to a point where it could be considered a viable potential product for the company. This is an actual slide that I have permission to share with you that we brought to the investment committee, that brought forward a set of incentives that perhaps weren't the most quantifiable at the time, particularly the one that we had the red box around. But we seized upon a moment, and the introduction of the Access to Medicines Index, which we've highlighted here today. We emphasize the values of the company and the importance of realizing those values through every investment we made. And we defined success very differently for this product, and suggested that there was an opportunity to expand our footprint as a company and test new sustainable business models and so forth. This was a fight to the finish internally. I can tell you it was a tortured process, winning allies for a drug that did not completely meet this threshold of commercial viability. Nonetheless, we pushed forward, gained sufficient support, and really in its own heroic effort, we were able to advance the drug even through the very expensive process of regulatory review and approval and market entry. It wasn't a perfect process. We were lacking, and I think really naive with respect to stakeholder engagement and so forth, and took some slings and arrows as a result of that. There were some missteps on some of the more creative pricing that we considered around the drug, something we called equity-based tiered pricing. But there was an earnestness that I hope all of you can resonate with. And we had something in our back pocket that was frankly very powerful, and that was a priority review voucher for this drug that was awarded to us for this early work on the drug, and would be something that we could use to be able to secure some sort of compensation for our work, even despite relative inability to price it and introduce it to the world in the way that we would a sort of typical drug under the classic market model. I think what's important for you to understand here is that, we wanted to bring that earnestness to the way that we use the PRB, and we wanted to set a new standard for how it might be used. We ended up selling the PRB internally. That way we had a really transparent view on the actual value and could really set up the health economics model in a way that was truly fair and commensurate with the true value of the PRB as we understood that it could be. We sold it internally to our group in immunology. And as a result, we were able to secure even hundreds of millions of dollars appropriately to start actually a new group at Johnson & Johnson, which we named Global Public Health. And for the first time, really as a standard setting, I think industry leading initiative, we were able to bring under a single organization work in MDR, TB, HIV. We expanded that to Ebola and so forth, and set forth a very, very powerful model through the power of internal corporate advocacy. Again, something very powerful that I hope some of you will be able to participate in, even where you consider it, a career risk and so forth. I think models are changing and there's an allowance for this in ways that are useful. Interestingly here, as I mentioned, opportunity costs at the start of my presentation, and I also mentioned a very direct and clear opportunity cost in the form of taking dollars from our neuroscience group. As a give to them, we, again, in an industry leading way, we offered to include global mental health as part of the mandate of this group as we would shape it from the ground up. And I think in that way, we were more pioneering than we realized. But I'll close on this point. The fact is that global public health at Johnson & Johnson, and for as much energy as there was around it from the start, it's faded relative to what it once was. The team there has been culled significantly, and it's moved to, in some ways, a figurehead group within the organization, I think in a way that, has everyone who participated in the early work a bit crestfallen. And part of that is because of the lack of stacked and continued incentives to support its ongoing work in a constraining capital markets environment, a very challenging industry environment for Johnson & Johnson, and in ways that just kept what Gary termed in the context of Rwanda, this dramatic and sustainable gains over the long term. Those can be difficult to achieve, and that's part of why we need people like you in this conversation today, carrying batons forward and continually thinking creatively and stacking those carrots upon carrots. And just some additional thoughts to include for all of the respondents that I read, at least into the Access to Medicines Index for 2022, and those key findings that may have some of you crestfallen. Hopefully you'll see those key findings as opportunities for advocacy and creativity. And hopefully you'll see those gains that have been made, that progress within the industry and more broadly, as opportunities to build. I do believe that the industry can and must do more and do better. I hope you see it that way too. And I hope that you'll look at new approaches and models that can drive positive and urgently needed change. You have a tremendous point of inspiration with you in the form of your professors here. And I hope that you'll take inspiration from them and from those of us who have been on the ground like Dan and like Gary and myself, and recognize that for all of the despair that we've seen drawn from lack of access to healthcare, the market failure that it's at the root of so much of it is surmountable, and sustained progress is possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Jami Taylor. And please, any questions from the students first and foremost to Jami, and then also to Dan. Gary had to leave early today. Okay, then I will start with the question and see whether you can, in the meanwhile, think of more to ask. Jami, I wanted to ask you a little bit about roughly how the pressures, the financial pressures that you spoke about, how much freedom do they leave? You say there is room for creativity, but how much room really is there? And in particular, when you talked about these competitions between good and good, are there sometimes opportunities for firms to do both projects, that they are, are there sort of rigid constraints on the financing that's available, or is it not possible without derailing a project that might otherwise go forward to add a project to the list, simply hire a few extra people, maybe create an additional lab or something of that sort, which would maybe make these constraints a little bit less severe?
I love that you answered that question in part because it illustrates so much of the way that you think, Thomas, and really that mindset and that frame of thinking. How can we make these constraints less severe is really what the industry needs, and thinking less in terms of zero-sum game and really considering some creative aspects. We had to get very creative in Johnson & Johnson Global Public Health, especially as we folded in new projects, new ideas, even passion projects and so forth, as we pushed our way into emerging and frontier markets and saw, I think, the seriousness of unmet need, and also really drew upon our own knowledge of our own pipeline and could see what we could do in these markets. And so we brought back a lot of insights and brought them to the larger organization. And we would ask from within. We would ask very creatively, looking for more resources, even on a quote unquote volunteer basis. And we built new programs for even sabbaticals, experts from different corners of the organization to come and participate with us, which helped to grow and enrich our organization as we were building it. We also, in the spirit of everything that Dan talked about, I think Dan is such a paragon of partnership excellence. We started to pursue partnerships very differently. And it may seem, even unseemly, and I could tell you it's very uncomfortable for us as a large multinational corporation to go to public sector entities and begin to ask for things like basic NIH grants and so forth. But we hired a grant writer of all things. And although it raised some eyebrows, we were able to really pull in some financing tools from public sector entities, almost in the spirit of Health Impact Fund, not in, of course, a formalized way, but asking, because we had worthy projects, certainly as worthy as an academic institution lab might have, but that needed more support than we could always garner internally. We participated very heavily in NTD and AMR advocacy over a period of time. If you look at the congressional record, you can see Johnson & Johnson pushing its way into congressional testimony and so forth on these topics, so that it could be clear that private sector actors were very much there and wanted bigger solutions and new business models. So there was a lot of creativity exercise, certainly more room for that sort of creativity. But when there's that real knowledge of the unmet need, which I think we had acutely because we, like Gary and Dan, spent that time on the ground to really understand it, it imbued in us a sense of urgency that no one could ignore internally or externally. And that allowed for tremendous success in many respects throughout our work within the GPH organization.
And the Wall Street guys, would they be breathing down your necks, or would they? Do you basically win them over, or do you obfuscate in a way that you say that you make sure they don't fully understand that this may not be the most profitable venture?
So it's interesting. You just brought back to me, I think, one of the darkest days of my own career. And that was the day that we at Johnson & Johnson announced that we would be pursuing work in a very ardent way, even unlocking corporate reserves in terms of money and the cash reserves of Johnson & Johnson to support the Ebola response, and that we would be doing that through many different mechanisms, but most specifically development of an Ebola vaccine. And to watch our stock slide in the way that it did really taught us the importance of educating the capital markets environment and helping to really change that character of capital. One of the things that I and others on my team chose to do at that time was to make a priority engagement with what at the time wasn't called environmental, social, and governance, ESG investors, but we pursued impact investors. We dispatched ourselves to Northern Europe, where this movement was really taking hold. And we educated those investors about global public health and urged them to become shareholders in Johnson & Johnson to allow us to counterbalance against some of that cutthroat element and allowed us to achieve what we thought needed to be the core mission of the company, unscathed and unfettered by some of those more cutthroat elements that really defined so much of what the constraints that we were under. So that engagement was something I didn't expect to do as part of the Global Public Health Organization, but it returned a lot to us in spades and provided us a certain degree of cover, especially as the ESG movement grew over time.
Mm-hmm. Any student questions in particular?
Yeah, I had a question for Jami, and well, I actually had two questions. So the first one is like, what are some like specific things on a policy side that you're kind of looking for, either in the US or in Europe or whatever, where I guess like that could kind of impact the R&D sphere? Because I think just personally, I think, you know, I like it is like increasingly complicated, and I like kind of like personally, I kind of feel like someone kind of needs to kind of like step in and like do something about that. So like, what does that kind of look like? And also like, would kind of like the drug approval process like want to be changed a bit so that we can kind of expedite it for specific drugs or things like that? And then my second question that I think Dan can also kind of answer is like, in what role do like NGOs and like kind of like, you know, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation like kind of play into kind of like, once this drug is produced, like how, like you talked a lot about like Johnson's like reputation across like in the world and everything like that. I guess like what role do these pharmaceutical companies see that these different players like having in terms of like really getting it out there instead of just like, you know, making this drug, and, you know, like what's the next step from there?
Justin, those are great questions. I'm going to pass some of it to Dan, obviously, around the role of foundations, et cetera. But this was what we wrestled with most heavily. And even at a small biotech now, this is what we wrestle with most heavily, is this last part of your set of questions. And that's, how do we actually provide access in a practical way when our expertise really is around the innovation side? We can discover drugs, we can develop them. When it comes to actually distributing them, that becomes its own barrier and will often stop R&D investment at the start. Sometimes it's absorptive capacity, which is the guiding euphemism, but really a lot of it is about footprint and ability to actually traverse that last mile in a practical way and, you know, relatively low risk way. And that's where partners can come in, thinking about models and some of what you asked at the outset. One of the things that we did at Johnson & Johnson, I mean, we did not, frankly, we had, for as large a company as we did not have an MDR-TB accommodating infrastructure. We had never worked in slums in South Africa. We had almost no footprint prior to our MDR-TB drug, even in large markets like India. I mean, our pharma team there was less than a dozen people. I mean, at that time, right? You know, fewer than 12 people. We hadn't worked in settings like slums and public hospitals and places like Kazakhstan. And there was a lot of trepidation even around that. So we partnered with USAID and said, we need you to effectively be our commercial arm. We need you to take your network of hundreds of community offices around the world in these frontier market settings. And we need you to find ways, and we'll develop it with you, but distribution hubs for sustainable and appropriately stewarded access. It was a breakthrough partnership, I think a model in its own right. But one thing we really needed, that took a huge amount of financial resource for us to be able to we actually paid for USAID to develop its own capacities and build on its capacities. What would have been especially helpful if in addition to the PRV, which allowed for those regulatory flexibilities and that transferable regulatory flexibility that you mentioned, to have even a second sort of golden ticket, if you will, around access and compensation for access, and USAID in partnership with FDA waiting at the wings to be able to absorb and distribute that drug and drugs like it around the world, and really ready-baked, instilled partnerships that didn't require a lot of setup costs and so forth. So think about carrot upon carrot. I think that's really important. You mentioned regulatory speed. very controversially, Peggy Hamburg, who was commissioner of FDA, who'd actually built her reputation on TB control in New York, and that really elevated her to the role of FDA commissioner. Very controversially, she, based on the data that was available, approved bedaquiline for market entry based on phase 2B data and not phase 3 data, which was groundbreaking, you might argue, in its own right. It's definitely controversial. I mean, some ask, well, is it, appropriate to have lower safety standards for people in frontier markets? But her argument was the unmet need is so severe, our quickness is paramount. I believe she saved many lives through that movement and really set a standard of accelerated regulatory path that I hope that can be applied to NTDs going forward. And so now I'll pass it to Dan to talk a little bit about the role of foundations and maybe how they can play a role where a product might be innovated, but needs that access arm on the ground to really have its potential be realized. Dan, of course, you've mentioned cervical cancer, for example, and some of the work that you've done there.
Yes, thank you so much, Jami, and I really appreciate you for your presentation. Yeah, so as you know, when we are thinking about health inequalities, cancer of the cervix is a major inequality issue. There is a lot of inequality gaps. For instance, women in the rural, for them to be screened, to be attended to, they have to move, say, from where I am in the rural area of Kenya to Nairobi, about 450 kilometers away. And so that in itself, the transport and the challenges with the transport accommodation, those are barriers to them accessing health services. And there are also myths around screening women and giving children between age 9 to 15 HPV. And so what we are doing is working with the county first ladies, these are wives of the governors, to create awareness and also to increase uptake of screening services and treatment. And so J&J can work with us in reducing such inequalities, especially what is happening on the ground is that even the devices, speculum for screening are not available. And so because of the poverty status of this population, you find that people would rather do the screening in urban areas where people can pay for than to do it in the rural. So the social determinants of health, like poverty, is a major source of healthcare inequalities in the rural. And so I'm looking for ways that we can work with an esteemed organization like us. And again, I have seen you deal with the neglected tropical diseases. Here we have what is called jiggers. Maybe you have heard about that. And it affects a lot of people due to poor hygiene condition in the rural. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to partner.
And really, I loved what Gary said about accurate empathy. He said accurate empathy is all about providing what people need, and where we can infuse that accurate empathy and accurate stacks of incentives, communication, stitching all of these actors together, I think that we can get there. Okay. Thanks, Justin, for your question.
So with everyone's patience, I would like to ask one more question that comes out of Gary's talk in a way, and see what our other two guests think about that. One thing that makes Partners in Health so unique is the idea that they said that even the poorest people on earth should have healthcare that is comparable to the best healthcare that is available anywhere. And that, of course, has consequences about priority setting. So Partners in Health has focused on a relatively small group of poor people, poor populations, and really brought advanced modern healthcare to those people. I think Gary today mentioned 10 million people total who are being supported by Partners in Health. So the obvious counter alternative would be to say we should try to help a larger number of people, even at the expense of not giving them access to the state-of-the-art treatments, but do cut corners, do a cheaper version, inferior healthcare, maybe the kind of healthcare that was available in North America and Europe 40, 50 years ago, and give them that, and thereby be able to reach a larger number of people. So, Dan, can you talk a little bit about that, how you face this sort of dilemma in your own work? Sort of, are you trying, like Gary, to bring people up to the standard of the best healthcare available anywhere on Earth, or are you compromising in a way, saying we need to reach more people, and if that means that some people cannot get the most advanced treatment, then so be it?
Thank you, Thomas. We are giving the best of care possible. Our care is controlled by safety, timeliness, efficiency, effectiveness, equity, which I think is your main area, and patient-centeredness. And those are from the dimensional perspective of quality of care. They are all captured in the kind of services we have. We have actually also employed a quality manager whose work is to ensure that we adhere to those 6 dimensional aspects of quality of care.
And in that same spirit, to round us out, I'll just emphasize that going forward, I hope that every company will have every incentive to place access as its guiding frame and priority in the early R&D process forward, so that we don't, at the back end of that process downstream, end up with a 2-tiered healthcare system in the sense of the necessity thereof, where access really can be the guiding frame, considering simplicity and scalability. Even in our most advanced technologies in medicine, I think that we can get to the place that we're seeking. That's certainly the objective that I'm very much a part of in my day-to-day work, and access as a fundamental R&D priority, even the guiding frame, is what guides my work and my team's work every day. And hopefully that's something that we can spread as an industry norm.
Okay, we are way out of time, and so unfortunately have to close at this point, but we are deeply grateful for all 3 of our guests today, the 2 who are still here and Gary, who had to leave early. And the recording, with everybody's permission, of this will be posted on the Global Justice website.